Hey guys, tonight we're not talking about medieval torture devices or royal scandals. We're talking about monks, the supposedly calm, serene, disciplined men who dedicated their lives to God in monasteries. But let me break the illusion right away. It wasn't peaceful, it wasn't silent, and it definitely wasn't relaxing. In fact, the first thing to greet you every single morning wasn't divine light, it was the monastery bell. A bell so loud and unrelenting that it made modern alarm clocks sound like sweet lullabies. This bell wasn't a gentle chime. It wasn't the soothing ding of mindfulness apps. It was metal on metal, rung before dawn, in the pitch-black chill. Loud enough to wake the dead, or at least the half-dead monks who had just managed 2 or 3 hours of sleep. And unlike you, snoozing under your blanket, there was no button to hit, no 5 more minutes. The rule was simple. When the bell rang, you got up. If you didn't, you weren't just late for work, you were late for God. And in the medieval imagination, that wasn't something you could explain away with, "Sorry, I overslept." Picture it. You're wrapped in your scratchy robe, lying on a straw mattress that feels like someone stuffed it with sticks, just to remind you life is suffering. Your body aches from fasting, your stomach growls, your joints creak, and suddenly clang, clang, clang. The bell doesn't stop. It echoes through stone corridors, rattling the thin wooden doors of your cell, vibrating through your skull until you're up whether you want to be or not. Sleep wasn't a gift in the monastery, it was a temptation to be crushed. Too much of it, they believed, weakened the soul. Which is convenient for an abbot who wants everyone awake at 3 a.m. And the cruelest part? This wasn't just once a day. Monks were woken multiple times throughout the night for prayer sessions called vigils. Imagine falling into an exhausted sleep only to be dragged back out of it by the bell again, over and over. It wasn't holiness, it was sleep deprivation dressed up as discipline. And don't think you could get away with grumbling either. Complaining about the bell was complaining about God's time, which could earn you punishment. The monastery didn't just own your schedule, it owned your exhaustion. So, before you imagine monks meditating in perfect silence with a soft glow of candlelight, remember the truth. Every single day began the same way, with the violent, merciless clang of a bell that stripped away any hope of peace. The bell was more than an alarm. It was a command, a reminder that your life was no longer yours. You didn't wake up because you wanted to. You woke up because the monastery demanded it. And if you thought the mornings were bad, just wait, because that bell was only the beginning. So, you've been jolted awake by the merciless clang of the monastery bell. Congratulations, you're alive, but you immediately regret it. You drag yourself out of your straw-filled excuse for a bed, and the very first thing that greets you isn't divine warmth. It's the floor. Stone. Freezing. Harder than your faith and colder than your future. Your bare feet slap against it, and suddenly you understand why monks talked so much about suffering. This wasn't spiritual metaphor. It was basic biology. You were freezing, and every step was a reminder that God apparently hated comfort. Now, you might be tempted to splash some water on your face, just to wake up. Don't. That water is not coming from a tap. It's not flowing from a heated shower. It's not even room temperature. It's a bucket of ice-cold liquid that feels like it's been collected straight from a mountain stream designed by Satan himself. You dunk your hands in, and they go numb instantly. Splash it on your face, and congratulations, you've just achieved the medieval version of brain freeze. Except this isn't from ice cream. It's from the daily humiliation of cleansing yourself in water that could double as torture equipment. And here's the kicker. Monks believed cold water was good for the soul. It humbled the body, tamed the flesh, reminded you that this life wasn't meant for comfort, which is poetic until you realize it just meant permanent chilblains and cracked skin. Hygiene wasn't even the main goal. Bathing was rare, sometimes suspicious. Too much washing? Clearly you were vain. Too little washing? Perfect, you were holy. That meant the water wasn't about getting clean, it was about getting obedient. Picture yourself standing in that dark stone cell. No sunlight. Just the faint flicker of a candle that smells like old tallow. You're shivering, robe clinging damply to your skin, feet already numb, hands stinging from the cold splash. And there's no one to complain to, no roommate to say, "Man, this sucks," because the silence rule is in effect. You can't even mutter under your breath about how much you hate the floor. The cold isn't just physical, it's spiritual. It seeps into your bones, into your prayers, into the idea that the closer you get to freezing, the closer you are to God. But here's the cruelest part. You start to believe it. After a while, you stop hoping for warmth. You stop dreaming about comfort. You stop expecting anything soft, pleasant, or kind. The cold becomes your reality, your identity. It's not just the floor or the water that's frozen. It's your soul, locked in a discipline that mistakes misery for holiness. And every morning, as you drag yourself toward the chapel with icicles in your veins, you remind yourself, this isn't a punishment. This is devotion. At least, that's what they told you. Imagine starting your day with the one outfit you're forced to wear until it basically disintegrates. That was the reality of monastic robes. They weren't fashion, they weren't tailored, and they definitely weren't flattering. These weren't the sleek garments you see in modern films, flowing gracefully as monks meditate under temple arches. No, monastic robes were scratchy sacks of humility, designed less for comfort and more for reminding you that looking terrible was part of the deal. The robe was supposed to symbolize poverty, equality, detachment from the vanity of the world. Noble, in theory. But in practice, it meant you walked around every single day in the same woolen uniform that felt like it was made out of sandpaper. No seasonal variation, no closet options. No, what do I feel like wearing today? You wore the robe. Always. In summer, it trapped sweat and turned you into a walking oven. In winter, it held on to dampness so long you basically carried mold around on your skin. Either way, it clung like a reminder that your body existed mainly to be uncomfortable. And size? Forget about it. Robes weren't tailored to your frame. They were one size fits none. Too long, and you tripped over the hem during processions, which made for an especially spiritual kind of humiliation. Too short, and your ankles froze in drafty stone hallways. Belts were tied to hold the thing together, but half the time you looked more like a poorly wrapped package than a holy servant of God. And remember, shoes weren't always included. Some monks shuffled barefoot, their robes dragging through dirt and puddles, soaking up the very misery they were meant to embody. The smell? Let's just say laundry wasn't a weekly event. You might go weeks, even months, before that robe saw a washing tub. By then, it reeked of sweat, smoke, and candle grease, with a hint of mildew for good measure. Yet no one complained because if you did, it sounded suspiciously like vanity. Comfort was considered dangerous. Looking decent was prideful. Smelling clean? That was suspicious. Which meant your robe wasn't just clothing. It was a spiritual test stitched into every itchy seam. And here's the twisted part. After enough time, you stopped noticing. The itch became normal. The smell became background noise. The shapeless drape became your identity. The robe was no longer something you wore, it was something that wore you. It erased individuality, smoothed away vanity, and buried the very idea that your body was worth caring about. It was the perfect disguise. Hide the flesh, hide the ego, hide the person. So when you picture a monk gliding serenely down a cloister corridor, remember the truth. Underneath that holy uniform was a shivering, sweating, itching human being, trapped in cloth that was never meant to fit right. The robe wasn't freedom from the world, it was the weight of discipline, dragging on shoulders every single day. And tomorrow, when the bell rang again, you'd still be stuck in the same robe, carrying the same burden, with no escape except death. By the time dawn broke, your stomach was already protesting. Hours of chanting, shivering, and pretending the robe wasn't a personal enemy left you craving something warm, filling, maybe even enjoyable. Unfortunately, monasteries didn't specialize in enjoyment. Breakfast wasn't a reward for surviving the night. It was another trial, another sermon disguised as food. Forget eggs sizzling in a pan or bread warm from the oven. Breakfast for monks was usually a bowl of gruel, thin, grey, and so bland it made water seem exciting. Gruel wasn't a meal, it was edible humility. Sometimes it was oats, sometimes barley, sometimes just boiled weeds from the garden. If you were lucky, there might be a drizzle of honey on feast days. But most mornings, It was the same lukewarm sludge that clung to your spoon like it resented you. The logic behind this suffering was simple. Food should never be too good. If it tasted pleasant, you might get attached. If it filled you up, you might grow lazy. If it actually satisfied you, you'd start to forget that your body was supposed to be an enemy of the soul. Meals were designed to remind you that hunger was a virtue, taste was a temptation, and pleasure, especially the kind that came from your tongue, was dangerous. Bread, when it showed up, wasn't much of an upgrade. It was dense, stale, and cut your gums if you bit too carelessly. Milk was rare, eggs were rarer, and meat? Forget it. Meat was considered indulgent, a luxury reserved for feasts or the sick. Even then, it was often boiled into a grey paste that took more faith than appetite to swallow. And don't even dream of coffee. That was centuries away. The only thing remotely drinkable was watered-down ale, just enough to keep you from dying of thirst, but not enough to make life interesting. The silence rule made it worse. You sat shoulder to shoulder with your brothers, hunched over the same bowls of sludge, unable to share a joke, a groan, or even a complaint. The only sound was the scrape of spoons and the occasional cough echoing off the cold stone walls. Eating became less about nourishment and more about endurance. Every mouthful was a reminder that joy didn't belong at the table. Only obedience did. And yet, this ritual had power. It broke you down, not just physically but mentally. Breakfast taught you to expect nothing, to accept suffering as the baseline, to start every day by swallowing disappointment. Over time, the body adjusted, the cravings dulled, and hunger itself began to feel like devotion. The taste of blandness became the taste of holiness. But here's the irony. While monks preached detachment from worldly pleasure, the struggle with food often consumed them. They wrote entire rules about fasting, feasting, portion sizes, and forbidden flavors. Their lives revolved around not enjoying what they ate. Breakfast wasn't just the first meal of the day. It was the first battle of the soul, fought with spoons and silence. If breakfast felt like a test, obedience was the exam you never stopped taking. In a monastery, your personal will wasn't just discouraged, it was dismantled. Every choice, every action, every tiny decision you thought was yours had already been claimed by the rule of obedience. You didn't belong to yourself anymore. You belonged to the order. The idea was simple. Monks were supposed to kill pride at the root, and pride grew strongest in independence. So, obedience wasn't about cooperation, it was about total surrender. If the abbot said rise, you rose. If he said kneel, you knelt. If he said dig a ditch in the rain until your hands bled, you dug. And you didn't ask why, because why wasn't a word monks were allowed to use. Asking why meant questioning authority. Questioning authority meant questioning God. And questioning God meant you weren't just wrong, you were sinful. Daily life was structured to make sure this principle seeped into every part of you. Meals happened when the bell said so. Prayers happened at the exact minute they were scheduled. Work began and ended at the same times every single day, regardless of weather, health, or sanity. Even silence wasn't optional, it was commanded. Disobedience could earn you public humiliation, physical punishment, or days of penance that made your previous misery feel like luxury. Obedience wasn't just external, it was psychological. You were expected to anticipate commands, to obey before being asked, to align your thoughts so completely with the will of the community that your own desires ceased to matter. The abbot was treated as a living channel of God's authority. That meant if he told you to scrub the floor until your knuckles cracked, it wasn't the abbot's voice, it was heaven itself speaking through him. And you, lowly creature, weren't supposed to argue with heaven. This system produced a strange paradox. Monks were praised for humility, but humility itself became competitive. The more obedient you appeared, the holier you seemed. Brothers compared who could bow deeper, who could keep their eyes lowered longer, who could perform tasks with more silent compliance. Obedience became a game with no winner, because the more you submitted, the less you existed. And yet, this constant submission left scars. It wasn't peace, it was suppression. Some monks buckled under the weight, secretly resenting every command but too afraid to rebel. Others embraced it so fully that they forgot what independent thought even felt like. The monastery didn't need to break bones to break men, it only needed to break wills. What obedience really meant was this: you didn't own your life anymore. Every step, every breath, every flicker of thought was borrowed from an authority above you. And if you ever slipped, even for a moment, you weren't just disobedient, you were a soul in danger. The monastery didn't just demand compliance, it demanded you disappear. Life in a monastery wasn't measured by joy, accomplishment, or even the rising and setting of the sun. It was measured by the relentless tick of a schedule that carved your existence into rigid blocks of prayer, labor, and silence. To an outsider, it might look like discipline. To those living inside, it felt like a slow erosion of the self. The day began in the dead of night, with the first bell ripping you out of whatever scraps of sleep you'd managed to clutch. That was the signal for the first office vigils, or matins, long stretches of chanting psalms, while your stomach groaned and your eyelids drooped. Then came Lauds at dawn, a second round of prayer meant to remind you that rest was a weakness. The rhythm was deliberate. You never strayed far from the chapel, and you never slipped too deeply into comfort. Sleep, like every other human instinct, had to be broken into pieces and rationed like an enemy. But prayer wasn't the whole day. Work pressed itself into every hour not claimed by chanting. Gardens to weed, manuscripts to copy, floors to scrub, and all of it had to stop, no matter how urgent, the moment another bell sounded. Monks lived in submission to time itself. The schedule didn't bend for you, you bent for it. The cycle repeated endlessly. Prime at sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none at mid-afternoon, vespers at dusk, compline before what little sleep remained. 8 different offices, 8 interruptions that ensured no task, no thought, no private moment ever unfolded naturally. Your life was chopped into fragments, offered back to God in small, controlled portions. The message was clear. Spontaneity was sin, routine was salvation. Over time, this schedule wore men down. It wasn't violent, but it was relentless. Your body grew weary, your mind dulled, your spirit sagged. The monotony wasn't an accident, it was the point. The routine crushed individuality, silenced impulse, and molded every monk into the same grey pattern of existence. You weren't allowed to live a day. You were allowed to repeat one endlessly. And yet, this endless repetition was defended as holy. The schedule was seen as protection, a shield against distraction, a constant reminder of eternity. To the monks, the day wasn't supposed to be exciting, it was supposed to be sacrificial. By surrendering the very shape of their hours, they believed they were proving their devotion, but the reality was simpler and harsher. The schedule wasn't just order, it was a cage. Bells dictated your breath, your meals, your sleep, your prayers, until nothing belonged to you. The human spirit didn't thrive under it, it broke. And that was considered success. Silence sounds holy when you first imagine it. A quiet monastery, candles flickering, monks moving gently through stone corridors without a word. It feels like peace, like the world has finally hushed enough for the soul to breathe. But that's the illusion. Inside the monastery, silence wasn't freedom. It was a weapon, wielded as discipline, a constant reminder that even your tongue wasn't your own anymore. The rule of silence stripped away the simplest human comfort speech. You couldn't complain about the cold, you couldn't whisper to your neighbor at breakfast, you couldn't crack a joke to lighten the weight of endless chanting. Words were rationed like food, permitted only at certain times, in certain ways, often only to a superior. Anything outside of that was disobedience. Imagine living with dozens of men under the same roof, day in and day out, and never being allowed to say what you actually thought. And silence wasn't just absence of noise, it became a form of surveillance. You were always aware of your own mouth, your own impulses, your own desire to speak. The moment you felt words rise, you swallowed them down, a little act of self-erasure. Over time, you started policing not just your tongue but your thoughts. If you couldn't say it, maybe you shouldn't even think it. That's how silence crawled inside the mind, until even imagination felt dangerous. The monastery painted silence as a virtue, an open space for God's voice, a shield against idle chatter, gossip, and sin. But in practice, it was suffocating. Silence meant isolation, even in the middle of community. Brothers lived side by side, ate together, worked together, prayed together, yet each man carried his thoughts alone, locked behind his teeth. Loneliness wasn't the absence of people. It was the inability to reach them. And silence made sure you couldn't. Breaking silence carried penalties. A careless laugh, a whispered complaint, even a muttered prayer at the wrong time could lead to punishment. You might be forced to lie face down in the chapel while the others stepped over you, or given extra hours of menial labor, all because your voice slipped free when it shouldn't have. Silence wasn't peace. It was constant tension, the pressure of keeping yourself invisible in sound as well as sight. And here's the irony. Monks who endured years of this rule didn't always emerge enlightened. Some grew bitter, others broke entirely. Silence wasn't serenity. It was a slow grind, chiseling away at the human need for connection, until you either surrendered to the emptiness or withered under it. In the end, the monastery's great silence wasn't the voice of God filling the air. It was the sound of dozens of men slowly vanishing into obedience. If you thought monks at least earned a good night's rest after hours of fasting, praying, and hauling buckets of water, think again. Sleep, like food, was never simply given. It was dissected, debated, and rationed as if it were a spiritual drug. Too much of it was dangerous, they said. Too little, and you collapsed. The trick was to find that razor-thin line where your body suffered enough to prove your devotion, but not so much that you actually dropped dead in the chapel. The official rules were harsh. Monastic communities argued over how many hours were acceptable, but the numbers were always lower than what your body begged for. Some monasteries permitted 5 or 6 hours in fragments. Others slashed that down to 3 or 4, split by midnight vigils. Sleep was not rest. It was a temporary pause before another bell ripped you back into obedience. And because monks believed time belonged to God, every extra moment of rest felt like theft. Beds didn't help either. You weren't collapsing into soft straw or anything remotely cozy. You had a wooden plank or a thin sack of reeds, covered in a blanket that smelled like damp wool and old smoke. Comfort was the enemy, and the idea was to keep you alert even while you slept. That way, when the bell clanged in the middle of the night, you could stumble up quickly, bleary-eyed and aching, ready to chant psalms like a half-dead soldier, reporting for duty. Sleep deprivation wasn't considered a flaw in the system, it was considered holy. Staying awake meant vigilance against temptation. Nodding off meant weakness of the soul. Monks wrote about battling drowsiness like it was a demon. One fell asleep during prayers? Punishment. Another leaned against the wall for support? A lecture on sloth. The body's natural needs were treated not as limits but as sins to be conquered. And of course, there was competition. Some monks boasted, silently of course, about needing less rest than their brothers. The ones who managed to stay alert during midnight chants were praised as models of discipline. The ones who sagged or yawned too often were quietly judged as spiritually soft. Sleep became a measurement of holiness, as if exhaustion proved your faith more than prayer ever could. But here's the truth. It wore men down. Sleep lost blurred vision, twisted thoughts, and turned chanting into a blur of meaningless words. Some monks believed visions of angels or demons came to them in the night, but more often than not, those visions were just hallucinations brought on by relentless fatigue. The great debate wasn't really about how much sleep you deserved. It was about how much you could be denied without breaking. And in monasteries, the less you slept, the more convinced everyone was that God approved. If the bell and the lack of sleep didn't already grind you down, the chanting would finish the job. Chanting wasn't just a ritual in the monastery, it was the backbone of the entire day. Hour after hour, your voice was dragged into psalms, hymns, and litanies that repeated so often they blurred together into one endless drone. To outsiders, it might sound beautiful, a solemn harmony echoing through stone arches, but inside those walls, chanting wasn't artistry, it was labor. The rule was simple. Every prayer had to be spoken, sung, or murmured in unison. That meant your voice wasn't your own. It merged into the collective hum, swallowed by the sound of dozens of men, intoning syllables that never stopped. There was no space for individuality, no room to linger on meaning. Words became rhythm. Rhythm became monotony. And monotony became a cage that wrapped itself around your throat. It was exhausting in ways no one outside the cloister imagined. Hours of chanting strained your voice until it cracked, hoarse and raw. The acoustics of the chapel didn't help stone walls threw your sound back at you, magnifying every stumble, every waver. If your voice faltered, you weren't just embarrassed. You were failing in devotion. Holiness, in this context, was measured by endurance, not insight. Could you keep going when your throat burned? Could you press on when your chest rattled? The schedule guaranteed there was no escape. Vigils in the night, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Each hour had its soundtrack, and you were the instrument. Prayer didn't punctuate your day. It consumed it. Even when you weren't chanting aloud, the melodies and psalms lodged in your brain, circling endlessly like a tune you couldn't shut off. Sleep offered no relief. You often dreamed in chants, muttering verses in your half-conscious haze, and what made it harder was the silence wrapped around everything else. You couldn't balance the monotony with laughter, conversation, or even casual speech. The only words you were permitted to utter most days were prayers. That meant your entire vocabulary shrank into psalms. Chanting wasn't just something you did, it was something that replaced your voice altogether. Over time, voices wore out. Monks developed chronic coughs, damaged vocal cords, or simply rasped their way through prayers until nothing came out. Yet still, the expectation was the same. Chant, praise, repeat. If your voice broke, it was seen as sacrifice. If you collapsed mid-verse, your suffering was spiritualized as a gift. The irony? Chanting was supposed to lift the soul closer to heaven, but for most monks, it dragged their bodies deeper into exhaustion. It blurred into noise so constant it stripped words of meaning. Prayer became sound became duty, and duty became silence inside your own spirit. The chant never ended. It just broke you until you were too tired to remember why you started. When the chanting stopped, the silence didn't mean rest. It meant work. And one of the most dreaded assignments in the monastery was copying manuscripts. Forget the romance of being surrounded by illuminated texts and beautiful calligraphy. Copying books wasn't a creative art, it was slow-motion torture disguised as scholarship. Picture a narrow desk, a sheet of parchment, a dimly burning candle, and hours stretching ahead like an endless desert. Your quill had to be cut just right, your ink mixed carefully, and your posture kept rigidly straight. Then the real torment began, copying word after word, letter after letter, page after page. It wasn't optional, and it wasn't about choice. This was holy work. Every mistake, every smudged ink blot, every misshapen letter was a failure not just of the page but of obedience. The work destroyed bodies as quickly as it destroyed spirits. Eyes strained in dim light until the words on the parchment blurred into meaningless squiggles. Back muscles locked from bending over the desk. Fingers cramped around the quill until they ached. Hours passed without conversation, without music, without anything but the scratch of ink against vellum. This wasn't reading, it wasn't learning, it was endless reproduction, and it wore men down one letter at a time. Monks told themselves this was for God, that preserving texts was preserving knowledge, saving scripture, keeping the faith alive for future generations. But the truth was less noble in the moment. You weren't thinking about the glory of wisdom. You were trying not to fall asleep as the letters swam in front of your eyes. You were fighting the itch to scream, to snap the quill in half, to walk away from the desk and never come back. But you couldn't. The abbot's eyes, the weight of the rule, and the eternal threat of punishment held you in place. Mistakes carried penalties. Some monasteries forced monks to fast if they copied carelessly. Others made them rewrite entire pages by hand until the ink stains ran together. The fear of error meant every stroke of the quill was slow, deliberate, suffocating. And yet, mistakes still happened because humans aren't machines. The only ones who gained were the future generations who had neatly preserved manuscripts. The ones paying the cost were the monks who gave up their eyesight, their health, and sometimes their sanity in the process. And when the day ended, when your hands finally unclenched, You had nothing to show for it but another page in a book that looked exactly like the one you'd been copying yesterday. The work never ended, and the books never thanked you. Copying wasn't enlightenment, it was erosion, one stroke at a time, until the only thing you could see was the ink in front of you, and even that was fading into darkness. After hours of chanting and copying, you might imagine the gardens as a break, a chance to step outside into fresh air and sunlight. But in the monastery, gardens weren't peaceful sanctuaries. They were work sites, and the only thing they grew more reliably than vegetables was exhaustion. The logic was straightforward. Monasteries were supposed to be self-sufficient. That meant every monk was part farmer, whether he had any skill with soil or not. Gardens were divided into neat little plots, carefully tended rows of cabbages, beans, leeks, onions, and endless herbs. To visitors, it looked orderly, serene, even idyllic. To the monks bending over in the dirt, it was back-breaking labor. Dressed up as spirituality, you weren't planting seeds for your own meals. You were planting for the community, and often for guests, pilgrims, and nobles who arrived expecting hospitality. That meant the best of the harvest rarely ended up in your bowl. While abbots and visitors tasted fresh vegetables, you were usually left with watery stew, the scraps nobody else wanted. In theory, the garden sustained the whole house. In practice, it reminded you that your stomach wasn't the priority. The work itself was relentless. Soil had to be turned, weeds yanked out by hand, water hauled in buckets from wells. There were no breaks for aching backs or blistered fingers. Sun burned through heavy robes, rain turned the soil to mud, and winter froze the ground. So solid, you hacked at it, like a criminal digging through stone. Yet no matter how harsh the weather, the schedule demanded that the gardens be kept. To neglect them was to neglect obedience. And then there was the silence. Even here, outdoors, under the sky, you couldn't joke with the monk beside you. You couldn't share a story to pass the time. You worked shoulder to shoulder in quiet misery, trading only glances while your hands clawed at weeds. The garden was supposed to symbolize life, growth, abundance. Instead, it became another place where voices were buried along with the roots. Still, there was no denying the irony. The garden made the monastery look thriving. Green rows gave visitors the impression of order and harmony. Herbs scented the air, flowers brightened the cloisters, and fruit trees hinted at abundance. Outsiders saw beauty, insiders tasted monotony. Because when evening came and bowls were filled, the monks ate thin pottage, while the best produce had already been served to someone else. The garden gave life, yes, but not to you. It gave to the community's image, to its guests, to its survival at your expense. You broke your body in the dirt for food you rarely enjoyed, and when you finally dragged yourself back to the refectory, you were met with the same bland stew you'd been choking down for months. The garden's bounty was real. It just wasn't yours. Monasteries might look clean and orderly in paintings, but in reality, they were stone fortresses that collected filth faster than the monks could chase it away. Dust crept into every crevice, soot from candles coated walls, and damp air-bred mildew that clung to robes, floors, and even prayer books. Cleaning wasn't a weekly chore, it was an unending war, and the enemy always won. From the moment you woke, you were reminded that stone buildings didn't forgive. Cold corridors gathered dirt from sandals, kitchens reeked of smoke and grease, and the latrines, if you could call them that, spread their stench downwind into every cloister. Monks weren't free from the rules of hygiene, but their tools were primitive at best. Straw brooms shed more than they swept. Buckets of water turned dust into mud, and cloths were so rough they left your hands raw long before they scrubbed the walls clean. And cleaning wasn't optional. The monastery rulebook considered dirt not just unpleasant but sinful. Cleanliness symbolized purity, order, discipline. So every brother, no matter how sick of it, was conscripted into scrubbing floors, polishing altars, and hauling away waste. Dust wasn't just a nuisance, it was a spiritual foe, and the monastery demanded it be fought daily. The irony, of course, was that the battle never ended. Candles burned all day, showering soot back onto freshly scrubbed stone. Cold drafts blew in more dirt through every crack. Rain tracked mud into cloisters. Animals strayed into gardens and left their own unwelcome marks. You could spend hours cleaning only to see the grime return by nightfall, undoing everything. Monks called it discipline. To anyone else, it looked like futility. And let's not forget the stench. Without modern plumbing, the latrine pits overflowed, attracting flies and sickness. Smoke from kitchens and workshops clung to every surface. Even incense, meant to cover the odor with a sweet aroma, only mingled with it, creating an even heavier air. No matter how much you scrubbed, the monastery smelled like a mix of sweat, smoke, and damp stone. The worst part? You were expected to perform these tasks silently, as if cleaning in wordless misery somehow purified the soul more than doing it with laughter or conversation. Hours of back-breaking labor stretched on in a haze of dust and stink, and you couldn't even break the tension with a simple complaint. Every sweep of the broom was just another reminder that holiness was less about peace and more about persistence in the face of endless dirt. At the end of the day, the monastery still looked clean enough for visitors, but you knew the truth. The dust was never gone. It always returned, and with it came the sinking realization that this fight wasn't about winning. It was about showing up, every single day, to battle a foe you could never truly defeat. That wasn't purity. It was surrender, dressed up as devotion. If eating bland stew every day felt like a punishment, fasting was worse. Monks didn't just skip meals for health or discipline. They fasted because hunger was considered holy, a way to beat down the body until the spirit supposedly rose higher. Food wasn't nourishment, it was temptation, and denying it was seen as the surest way to get closer to God. The rules were merciless. Ordinary days already meant thin portions, but fasting days stripped that away completely. Bread crusts, maybe a handful of boiled greens, water, and nothing more. The calendar was dotted with fasts, Advent, Lent, vigils, saints' days, until it felt like the majority of the year was one long experiment in starvation. The point was never comfort. The point was to feel the ache, to embrace the weakness, to let hunger gnaw at you until your body surrendered. And hunger did gnaw. It hollowed out your stomach, drained your energy, and made every hour drag like lead. Work became torture. Chanting became an echo in your empty chest. Even walking turned into a struggle, as legs wobbled beneath robes that now hung too loosely. But you didn't dare complain. Complaining was proof that the body still held power over you. Better to suffer in silence and hope the gnawing inside could somehow be rebranded as devotion. Of course, fasting had side effects. Exhaustion blurred thought. Hallucinations crept in when the body was too weak to anchor the mind. Some monks believed these visions were divine, that angels or saints appeared to them in moments of frailty. Others whispered of demons crouching in the corners, born not from hell but from sheer starvation. The line between spiritual ecstasy and malnourishment was razor thin, and most of the time, nobody could tell the difference. Still, fasting was praised as victory. The weaker you looked, the more faithful you appeared. Hollow cheeks were marks of holiness. Trembling hands signaled a soul fighting hard. If you fainted during prayers, it wasn't failure, it was evidence of sacrifice. And those visions? They were retold as miracles, even if they were just the desperate brain sparking images in the dark. The cruelest irony was that fasting didn't really kill desire. It magnified it. Hunger took over the imagination, making monks dream obsessively about food while they told themselves to reject it. The very thing they were supposed to detach from consumed their thoughts. Instead of climbing closer to heaven, they often circled endlessly around bread, meat, and the idea of relief that never came. But no one dared admit it. Hunger was their badge of honor, the proof they could endure suffering without breaking. And in that quiet, shivering weakness, they convinced themselves they were closer to the divine. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. Hunger had become their prayer, and visions, real or imagined, were the only reward for an empty bowl. Monks didn't just fast. They denied themselves in every possible way, convinced that the less they had, the closer they were to heaven. Comfort wasn't just frowned upon. It was seen as a trap, a doorway through which pride and sin slipped in. The logic was brutal. If something felt good, it was probably dangerous. If something hurt, it was probably holy. That meant denial wasn't limited to food. Sleep was rationed, clothing was scratchy and thin, beds were hard, water was cold, work was endless. Even conversation, laughter, and friendship were restricted, all in the name of detachment. To outsiders, this might look like discipline, a radical form of commitment, but inside the cloister, it often felt less like freedom from the world, and more like stripping life of anything that made it worth living. The monks weren't simply cutting away luxuries, they were cutting away basic human needs. The warmth of a fire, the sweetness of fruit, the joy of music, these were luxuries that ordinary peasants might take for granted. But in the monastery, they were viewed as distractions from God. The irony was sharp. Monks claimed to renounce the world, yet they ended up obsessing over it more than anyone else. The harder they tried to detach, the more rules they built around the very things they were supposed to ignore. And it wasn't just physical denial. Emotional restraint was demanded too. Longing for family was weakness. Missing your childhood home meant your soul was still tied to earthly things. Even grief for a lost brother had to be muted, expressed only in approved rituals, never in the raw form of tears. The monastery demanded not only the sacrifice of comfort, but also the sacrifice of humanity itself. Some monks embraced it willingly, convinced that each act of denial polished the soul like a stone rubbed smooth. Others simply endured it, secretly longing for warmth, flavor, and companionship while outwardly wearing the mask of holiness. And a few broke under the pressure, collapsing into despair or abandoning the monastery entirely. But the system didn't care. The rule was clear: deny yourself, and deny again, until nothing was left but obedience. The strangest part? Self-denial was rarely about actually forgetting the world. It was about proving to others that you could survive without it. The holiest monk wasn't always the kindest or the most devout. He was the one who suffered most visibly, who shivered through the coldest nights and fasted through the harshest days without complaint. Holiness became a performance measured in scars, and that performance left its mark. The monastery didn't make men saints. It made them hollow, shaped by rules that confused misery with virtue. Self-denial wasn't a path to freedom. It was a mirror held up to suffering, forcing monks to stare until they convinced themselves the reflection was holy. Pain wasn't just something monks endured. It was something they cultivated, almost like a craft. To suffer well was to pray well, and to seek out discomfort was to prove your faith. What ordinary people fled from, monks leaned into, convinced that each sting and ache was a ladder step toward heaven. The methods were endless. Some wore hair shirts, garments woven from coarse animal fibers that scratched the skin raw with every movement. Others cinched ropes tightly around their waists until they left deep marks, a constant reminder of submission. Fasting left stomachs twisted in knots, and sleep deprivation made heads spin. Even the simplest tasks, like kneeling on stone floors for hours, became deliberate exercises in pain. The rule wasn't avoid suffering. It was find it, carry it, and call it holy. The reasoning sounded noble. Christ suffered, so his followers must share in that suffering. But in practice, it turned into a grim hobby. Pain became not just a side effect of devotion, but its measure. The monk who endured the most was seen as the most faithful. A brother who fainted from fasting was praised for his sacrifice. One who bore whip marks across his back was honored for discipline. What would horrify outsiders became badges of honor inside cloister walls. And the strange part? Pain began to twist into a kind of focus. Hunger cleared the mind until all you could think about was bread. Exhaustion silenced distractions until only the psalm in front of you remained. Burning muscles pushed aside doubts, forcing you to collapse into prayer because nothing else was possible. For monks, this clarity was mistaken for spiritual triumph, when in reality, it was just the body buckling under pressure. Of course, not every monk sought extremes. Some endured quietly, following rules without adding their own punishments. But others took it further, inventing new ways to prove their devotion through suffering. They believed the body was the enemy of the soul, and the only way to defeat it was through relentless attack. Whether it worked or not didn't matter. What mattered was that pain kept you awake, obedient, and afraid of slipping into comfort. But here's the irony. Pain didn't always lead to holiness. Sometimes it led to bitterness, resentment, or collapse. Sometimes it blurred the line between devotion and obsession, until monks were competing over who could suffer most, rather than who could love most. The monastery's strange arithmetic turned pain into a currency, traded for respect, fear, or the illusion of purity. In the end, the monastery didn't need to whip every monk. Many learned to whip themselves physically, mentally, spiritually, until suffering became second nature. Pain wasn't just tolerated, it was sanctified, wrapped in prayer, and offered back to God, as if misery itself could buy salvation. If you think monks balanced all their suffering with at least the occasional hot bath, think again. Bathing in a monastery wasn't a habit, it was practically a scandal. To wash too often was to risk being accused of vanity, as if the simple desire not to smell like mildew and sweat meant you cared more about your body than your soul. Water was everywhere in monastic life, used for cooking, for gardens, for rituals of purification, but when it came to bathing, the rules tightened. Once or twice a year was often enough. More than that, and eyebrows were raised. Why? People wondered. Did you need to be so clean? What exactly were you trying to wash away? Dirt was tolerated, pride was not. The facilities didn't make things easier. Most monasteries didn't have private baths or heated water. At best, you had a basin of cold liquid drawn from a well or stream. You splashed it over yourself in the dim light, teeth chattering, skin stinging, all while trying not to imagine how much cleaner you could feel if you actually scrubbed. Soap was rare and crude, made from lye that left your skin red and cracked. Washing wasn't refreshing, it was another kind of penance, and the smell, well, it clung to everything. Wool robes soaked up sweat and smoke until they reeked. Cells smelled of damp stone and mildew. The refectory carried the sour tang of unwashed bodies packed close together in silence. You learned quickly that odor wasn't just part of the atmosphere, it was part of the discipline. The body wasn't supposed to be indulged. If it stank, then good. That meant you weren't hiding behind luxury, yet not everyone agreed. Some monasteries allowed more frequent bathing, arguing that hygiene prevented illness and lifted morale. Others condemned it outright, treating cleanliness itself as indulgence. The debate revealed a deep tension in monastic life. Was holiness about denying the body or caring for it just enough to keep serving God? Most orders leaned toward denial. That meant dirt was safer than soap, and smell was safer than suspicion. For the monks, this wasn't just about water. It was about identity. A peasant bathed rarely because he had no choice. A noble bathed more often because he could afford it. A monk? He refused bathing precisely to reject both worlds. By shunning the comfort of cleanliness, he proved his separation from ordinary life. The grime became a badge of belonging, the odor a mark of holiness. It's almost laughable now, imagining a hall full of men chanting while reeking of sweat, smoke, and damp wool. But to them, the stench was sacred. It meant the body was being subdued, tamed, denied. Clean skin might have felt better, but in their eyes, it risked feeling too good. And anything that felt good was always one step away from sin. Silence might have muffled voices, but it didn't silence temptation. The monastery was supposed to be a fortress of discipline, a place where the world and its distractions were locked out. Yet monks quickly discovered that temptation doesn't need noise. It slips into the mind quietly, filling the spaces left empty by conversation and comfort. The human brain doesn't shut off just because the lips do. Thoughts ran wild, often in the very moments meant for prayer. Kneeling in the chapel, trying to focus on psalms, you suddenly remembered a song from childhood. Or worse, the taste of roasted meat you hadn't eaten in years. The very act of forcing silence only seemed to make the mind louder. What you couldn't say, you replayed internally until it grew unbearable. Desire often grew sharper in deprivation. The more fasting stripped the body, the more vivid the cravings became. Dreams swirled with visions of food, warmth, or touch. Some monks confessed to seeing women in their sleep, visions so detailed they woke trembling with shame. Others battled violent thoughts, anger, rebellion, even fantasies of walking away. The silence amplified them, like a chamber where every whisper of desire echoed tenfold. The monastery treated these thoughts as battles of the soul. Temptation wasn't random, it was proof the devil was always near, whispering in the cracks of silence. That meant every stray idea became a moral crisis. A daydream about a warm bed wasn't just weariness, it was weakness. A flicker of longing for conversation wasn't loneliness, it was sin. Monks carried guilt not just for what they did, but for what they imagined, over and over again. Confession became the only outlet. Monks lined up to spill every stray thought to their superiors, desperate to empty their minds before they drowned in guilt. And yet, confessing only reinforced the cycle. Naming the temptation gave it weight, carved it into memory. Silence didn't kill desire, it magnified it, then forced you to relive it in words of repentance. Some monks found ways to cope, chanting louder, working harder, punishing themselves with longer fasts or harsher disciplines. Others simply collapsed into despair, convinced they were too weak, too broken to ever reach holiness. Because in a monastery, temptation didn't just lurk in the silence, it lived there, feeding on the very rules meant to starve it. And that was the cruelest part. Monks fled the world to escape its snares, only to find the world alive and well inside their own minds. The silence didn't shield them. It trapped them with their thoughts, locking them in a cage where temptation always had the loudest voice. If silence magnified temptation, confession made sure you never forgot it. The monastery preached that no thought, no slip, no failure was too small to reveal. Every weakness had to be dragged into the open, dissected, and confessed to a superior. What was supposed to cleanse the soul often felt more like tearing it apart in front of an audience of one. The process was rarely gentle. You knelt before the abbot or confessor, head bowed, voice trembling, forced to speak every shameful detail. It didn't matter if the sin was great or small. Thinking of food during prayer? Confess it. Laughing silently in the cloister? Confess it. Dreaming of home, of warmth, of anything outside the monastery? That, too, was a fault in need of exposure. Your mind wasn't private property anymore. It belonged to the rule, and the rule demanded it be emptied. The interrogation could stretch on. Some confessors pressed for more detail, asking how often, how vividly, how strongly you had faltered. Monks described temptations with an almost painful clarity, words that made the shame feel worse, not lighter. The more specific you were, the more it felt like you were carving the sin deeper into memory instead of letting it go. And the punishments varied. Sometimes you were given extra prayers or longer fasts, as if starving or chanting would fix the flaw inside you. Other times, harsher penances came hours of labor, public humiliation, even lying face down on the chapel floor while the brothers stepped over you. Confession wasn't always a path to forgiveness. It was a reminder of your place, a way to stamp obedience deeper into your bones. The worst part was how constant it became. Thoughts never stopped, so sins never stopped. That meant confession became a revolving door, each monk coming back again and again to spill the same struggles, the same lapses, the same restless desires. It wasn't healing. It was a cycle of guilt, confession, and punishment that kept everyone bound to the same invisible chains. And though it was framed as honesty, confession often created fear. Brothers worried about what would happen if they said too much or if they said too little. Some confessed sins they hadn't even committed, desperate not to seem careless. Others grew paranoid, wondering if silence itself was hiding sin. The very tool meant to cleanse the soul ended up filling it with anxiety. The truth was this: confession sounded like salvation in theory. In practice, it echoed like torture words pulled out of you until your dignity frayed, punishments piling on until guilt became the air you breathed. It wasn't a path to peace. It was a ritual of exposure, designed not to free you, but to remind you that even your thoughts were never really your own. You might think that if monks couldn't find peace while awake, at least sleep would give them a reprieve. But even in dreams, there was no escape. The monastery taught that what surfaced in the night revealed the state of your soul. That meant every image, every vision, every flicker of desire that crept into your sleep could be treated as evidence against you. Dreams weren't dismissed as random nonsense. They were taken seriously, sometimes frighteningly so. If you dreamed of food, it was proof that gluttony still haunted you. If you dreamed of women, lust had infiltrated your soul. If you dreamed of violence, anger was alive and festering. Even harmless dreams, walking through fields, speaking with old friends, were suspect. Longing for the outside world suggested your heart wasn't fully committed to God. This made sleep a risky place. You could go to bed obedient, prayerful, and disciplined, only to wake up condemned by the visions you never chose. Some monks confessed their dreams as sins, humiliated by desires they hadn't acted on, ashamed of imaginations they couldn't control. Others feared their dreams so much that they fought to stay awake longer, exhausting themselves just to avoid the risk of seeing something they shouldn't in the night. And because dreams felt so vivid under constant fasting and sleep deprivation, hallucination and vision often blurred. A starving monk who dreamed of angels might wake, convinced he'd received a divine message. Another who dreamed of temptation might wake, convinced he'd failed God in his sleep. The monastery rarely clarified the difference. Visions could be praised as holy one moment and condemned as sinful the next, depending on who interpreted them. The result was paranoia. Every night became a gamble. Would your sleep betray you? Brothers whispered about nightmares they didn't dare confess, or about visions they hoped were divine but feared were demonic. The silence made it worse. With no one to talk to openly, dreams became secrets that weighed heavier than waking sins. Of course, the theology behind it was simple. The soul was always at war, even in sleep. But the effect was cruel. Monks were punished not only for what they did, but also for what their unconscious produced. The mind, never allowed freedom by day, found no freedom at night either. The cruelest twist was that even rest was colonized by guilt. Sleep wasn't an escape. It was another battleground, another chance to fail, another reminder that holiness was measured not by peace but by constant vigilance. And for men trapped in monasteries, dreams weren't windows to freedom. They were bars on a cage that followed them even into the darkness. For all the rules about food, sleep, and silence, nothing terrified monks more than doubt. Hunger could be explained away as discipline. Fatigue could be excused as weakness. But doubt struck at the very foundation of monastic life. To question the faith, even for a heartbeat, was treated as the gravest sin of all. Doubt wasn't limited to rejecting God outright. It could be as small as wondering if the rules were too strict. It could be as fleeting as asking yourself whether all those hours of chanting actually reached heaven, or whether they just echoed back off the cold stone walls. Even the thought that life might hold more outside the cloister could be enough to condemn you. Doubt wasn't an opinion. It was a threat, one the monastery worked tirelessly to stamp out, and it was everywhere. Exhaustion bred questions. Why should prayer replace rest? Hunger whispered suspicions. Why would a loving God demand starvation? Silence gave the mind too much room to wander, too much space for uneasy thoughts to grow. The very practices meant to deepen faith often cracked it open instead, letting doubt seep in quietly until it consumed you. But monks couldn't admit it. To voice doubt was to risk punishment, or worse, exile. So it was hidden, buried under layers of obedience. Some monks confessed doubt as if it were lust, choking out words they feared would damn them. Others dared not speak at all, carrying the weight of their questions in silence. Doubt wasn't just a personal struggle, it was a secret poison, and the longer it stayed unspoken, the more it spread. The community treated doubt like contagion. One monk's questions could unravel the certainty of others, so it had to be cut off quickly. A brother who expressed too much uncertainty might be reprimanded harshly, humiliated, or forced into harsher penance. Better to crush one man's spirit than let the infection spread through the cloister. Faith, after all, was fragile, and fragility couldn't be acknowledged, yet the irony was sharp. Doubt was unavoidable. No one could live in such deprivation, monotony, and silence without occasionally wondering if it was worth it. Faith demanded certainty, but the human mind is built for questions, and the stricter the rules, the heavier the silence, the harsher the penance, the more those questions grew in the shadows. To doubt meant you were human. But in the monastery, to be human was dangerous. You weren't supposed to wrestle with questions. You were supposed to strangle them before they could breathe. And in doing so, monks discovered the most terrifying truth of all. Sometimes, the thing you feared confessing wasn't sin, or temptation, or desire. It was the quiet suspicion that maybe, just maybe, God wasn't listening at all. If you've ever had a bad roommate, you know how miserable it can be. But in a monastery, You didn't just get unlucky with one for a semester. You were stuck with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of brothers for life, and there was no escape clause, no moving out, no switching cells. Once you joined, these men weren't just your companions. They were your permanent roommates, bound to you by silence, rules, and endless proximity. Cells were small, and privacy was a luxury nobody had. Thin wooden walls separated you from the man next door, so you could hear every cough, every snore, every restless shuffle in the night. Silence was supposed to keep things serene, but instead it made every sound stand out more. A clearing throat echoed like a shout. A single creak of a bed frame could gnaw at your nerves while you fought to stay obediently quiet. And then there were the smells. Remember, bathing was rare. That meant your roommate's robe carried weeks of sweat, smoke, and mildew. Add the stench of communal latrines wafting down the corridor, and suddenly your holy brothers felt less like companions on the path to God, and more like obstacles in your desperate attempt to breathe. Conflict brewed under the surface. Monks couldn't argue openly, but irritation leaked out in other ways. A brother might slam a door harder than necessary. Another might take your spot in the garden line, or drag his feet just enough to annoy everyone walking behind him. You weren't allowed to fight, but you were allowed to stew, and stew you did silently, bitterly, endlessly. The hierarchy made it worse. Younger monks had to obey elders, even if those elders were petty, arrogant, or hypocritical. You couldn't call someone out for laziness if they outranked you. You couldn't defend yourself if they accused you of pride. Every shared space became a minefield of unspoken resentment, covered over by forced obedience. Living in a monastery wasn't brotherhood, it was containment, and there was no escape. In the outside world, you might leave the house, take a walk, find space to cool off. Here, you were always under watch, always surrounded, always trapped within the same stone walls. Your roommates were in the chapel beside you, the garden behind you, the refectory across from you. Their flaws became your daily reality, their quirks your permanent burden. The monastery preached community, the beauty of shared life dedicated to God. But for many, it felt less like unity and more like a sentence. You didn't get to choose your brothers. You endured them, day after day, until the idea of solitude didn't just sound appealing, it sounded like salvation. Life in the monastery was supposed to rise above worldly conflict. After all, these were men who had abandoned wealth, pleasure, and power to devote themselves fully to God. But stripping away worldly distractions didn't erase human pettiness, it only concentrated it. With no family, no possessions, no careers, and no real escape, monks found themselves fighting not over kingdoms or fortunes, but over crumbs of daily routine. Disputes broke out over the smallest things. Who sang slightly off-key during chants? Who walked too slowly in procession? Who left mud on the cloister floor after working in the garden? Silence didn't prevent arguments. It made them more creative. A hard glare across the refectory, a deliberate scrape of a chair, an exaggerated sigh at the wrong moment. These were the weapons of monastic conflict. Food was a constant source of tension. Even though meals were meager, brothers still managed to quarrel over portion sizes, or who got the slightly less stale piece of bread. The irony of men fasting for holiness and then silently fuming over soup portions was lost on no one. And because speaking out wasn't allowed, grudges festered quietly until they erupted in confession, where monks admitted not just to temptation but to resenting their brothers for absurdly small slights. Clothing and tools caused more trouble. A robe patched with better fabric could spark envy. A sharper quill for copying books might be seen as favoritism. Even garden hoes became symbols of power, if one brother always claimed the sturdiest one. With so few belongings allowed, the little that remained took on exaggerated importance, turning scraps into status symbols. Hierarchy sharpened every quarrel. Elders scolded juniors for imagined lapses, while younger monks seethed under orders that felt arbitrary. A misplaced glance could be read as pride. A moment's hesitation might be labeled disobedience. Monks weren't free to argue openly, so instead, they endured a system where every interaction carried a quiet undercurrent of suspicion and rivalry. What outsiders imagined as harmony was often anything but. Behind the solemn chanting and ordered routines, monks carried grudges that grew heavier with time. Living in close quarters magnified flaws. and the rule of silence meant they rarely resolved them. Instead, resentments simmered until they hardened into bitterness, creating lifelong feuds conducted entirely without words. And yet, these petty fights rarely broke the system. They became part of it, absorbed into the endless rhythm of confession, penance, and obedience. A brother might resent you for weeks, but eventually he'd kneel beside you in prayer, both of you pretending unity while silently stewing. The monastery preached detachment from the world, but the truth was clear. When you take away money, families, and possessions, human pride doesn't vanish. It simply finds new battlegrounds. And in cloisters built for holiness, those battlegrounds often looked absurd, tiny quarrels blown into lifelong grudges over things no outsider would ever call important. Life in the monastery was supposed to rise above worldly conflict. After all, these were men who had abandoned wealth, pleasure, and power to devote themselves fully to God. But stripping away worldly distractions didn't erase human pettiness, it only concentrated it. With no family, no possessions, no careers, and no real escape, monks found themselves fighting not over kingdoms or fortunes, but over crumbs of daily routine. Disputes broke out over the smallest things: who sang slightly off key during chants, who walked too slowly in procession, who left mud on the cloister floor after working in the garden. Silence didn't prevent arguments, it made them more creative. A hard glare across the refectory, a deliberate scrape of a chair, an exaggerated sigh at the wrong moment. These were the weapons of monastic conflict. Food was a constant source of tension. Even though meals were meager, brothers still managed to quarrel over portion sizes, or who got the slightly less stale piece of bread. The irony of men fasting for holiness and then silently fuming over soup portions was lost on no one. And because speaking out wasn't allowed, grudges festered quietly until they erupted in confession, where monks admitted not just to temptation but to resenting their brothers for absurdly small slights. Clothing and tools caused more trouble. A robe patched with better fabric could spark envy. A sharper quill for copying books might be seen as favoritism. Even garden hoes became symbols of power if one brother always claimed the sturdiest one. With so few belongings allowed, the little that remained took on exaggerated importance, turning scraps into status symbols. Hierarchy sharpened every quarrel. Elders scolded juniors for imagined lapses, while younger monks seethed under orders that felt arbitrary. A misplaced glance could be read as pride. A moment's hesitation might be labelled disobedience. Monks weren't free to argue openly, so instead, they endured a system where every interaction carried a quiet undercurrent of suspicion and rivalry. What outsiders imagined as harmony was often anything but. Behind the solemn chanting and ordered routines, monks carried grudges that grew heavier with time. Living in close quarters magnified flaws, and the rule of silence meant they rarely resolved them. Instead, resentments simmered until they hardened into bitterness, creating lifelong feuds conducted entirely without words. And yet, these petty fights rarely broke the system. They became part of it, absorbed into the endless rhythm of confession, penance, and obedience. A brother might resent you for weeks, but eventually he'd kneel beside you in prayer, both of you pretending unity while silently stewing. The monastery preached detachment from the world, but the truth was clear. When you take away money, families, and possessions, human pride doesn't vanish. It simply finds new battlegrounds. And in cloisters built for holiness, those battlegrounds often looked absurd, tiny quarrels blown into lifelong grudges over things no outsider would ever call important. Monasteries loved to advertise themselves as communities of equals. Everyone wore the same rough robe, ate the same tasteless food, slept on the same hard beds. On the surface, it looked like true humility. No wealth, no privilege, no difference between rich and poor. But peel back the thin layer of uniformity, and you'd see a hierarchy as rigid as any kingdom outside the cloister walls. At the top sat the abbot, a figure with near absolute authority. His word was law, his interpretation of the rules unquestionable. Obedience to him wasn't just respect, it was obedience to God himself, or at least that's what the monks were told. If the abbot decided something, it was final. He could assign chores, enforce punishments, and even shape the daily schedule. For a man who claimed to have renounced worldly power, the abbot held plenty of it. Below him, Offices filled the monastery with ranks: the prior, the cellarer, the sacristan, the infirmarian. Each had authority in his domain, and each could make life easier or far harder for the brothers beneath him. The cellarer controlled food supplies, which meant resentment flowed as freely as the watery stew he served. The sacristan oversaw the chapel, scolding monks for candles placed wrong or psalms sung off-key. Even laundry and gardens had their supervisors, who could assign back-breaking work at will. For the ordinary monk, life meant constant deference. Younger brothers bowed to older ones. Lay brothers, who handled most of the manual labor, stood a step below choir monks, who spent more time in prayer and copying. Equality existed in theory, but in practice, it was an intricate ladder. You climbed only by surrendering more of yourself, and this hierarchy bred tension. Obedience was demanded, but favoritism was common. A monk with connections to noble families might rise faster. A brother who excelled at copying manuscripts might receive lighter labor. Meanwhile, others broke their backs in gardens or kitchens for years with no recognition. The cloister promised fairness, but delivered a system where some voices carried and others were swallowed. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on the monks. They knew equality was preached louder than it was practiced. Yet speaking against it risked being labeled disobedient or prideful. So complaints turned inward, simmering quietly while the structure remained untouched. Silence and obedience covered the cracks, but the cracks were always there. The truth was that the monastery wasn't a house of equals. It was a miniature society with rulers and subjects, privileges and punishments, power and submission. The robes might have been the same, but the lives inside them were not. And for every monk who preached humility, another enforced it with the weight of authority. Bread was supposed to be simple. Flour, water, heat. That's it. But in the monastery, even bread carried politics. It wasn't just food. It was a mirror of privilege, hierarchy, and the endless human tendency to measure holiness by who chewed what. Daily loaves were coarse and heavy, often baked from barley or rye, sometimes stretched with beans or acorns when supplies ran low. They were hard enough to chip a tooth, dense enough to double as a weapon. Ordinary monks gnawed on these blocks like prisoners, soaking them in watery stew just to make them edible. Bread was meant to humble, to strip away pleasure, to remind you that sustenance wasn't the same as satisfaction. But not all bread was equal. In many monasteries, the abbot and his inner circle received loaves baked from finer wheat, softer, lighter, easier to chew, sometimes even warmed before being served. These weren't luxuries by noble standards, but compared to the slabs on everyone else's plates, they were practically divine. Brothers noticed who got the better slices, and resentment spread in silence. No one dared call it favoritism, but everyone knew what it was. Feast days made the divide even clearer. On high holy days, a little honey might be drizzled, or white flour bread might appear for a select few. Ordinary monks still sat in silence with their barley lumps, watching as others enjoyed loaves that actually resembled food. The rule of equality bent whenever it passed through the kitchen, and the cracks it left were hard to ignore. Even scraps could spark tension. A monk with an extra piece of softer bread might share it with a friend or hold it close, savoring his luck in secret. Sharing showed charity, but keeping it was safer. Bread was more than calories. It was proof of where you stood. To taste softness was to taste privilege, however small. And it wasn't just about hunger. Bread carried symbolism. Christ himself was called the bread of life. That meant every loaf wasn't just food, it was theology. To serve different qualities of bread was to serve different qualities of holiness, whether anyone admitted it or not. The abbot's wheat bread said his soul mattered more. The monk's barley brick said his holiness was found in chewing misery. No one fought openly over it, of course. The rule of silence smothered complaints, but the politics of bread left their mark. Brothers carried bitterness along with their crumbs, quietly judging each other over what landed on their plates. For a community that preached detachment from the world, the cloister managed to turn even bread into a hierarchy. It's almost absurd. Men who renounced wealth and power still found themselves measuring life by crusts of bread. But that's the truth of monasteries. Strip life down to its barest elements, and you'll find that even bread's stale, hard, unremarkable bread becomes a battlefield. If monastery life already felt harsh, winter turned it into a season of pure punishment. Cold didn't just creep into the cloister walls, it lived there, settling into every stone, every robe, every brittle bone. The monastery wasn't built for warmth, it was built for endurance, and winter tested that endurance to its breaking point. Heating was minimal, fires were rationed, usually kept only in the kitchen or near the abbot's quarters. Ordinary monks shuffled through freezing corridors where frost clung to the stone like another layer of mortar. Your cell wasn't a sanctuary, it was an icebox. Blankets were thin, often damp, and did little more than trap the chill against your skin. Sleep became a nightly battle, not against temptation or doubt this time, but against the very real threat of freezing. Clothing didn't help much. That same scratchy robe you wore in summer now felt like a mockery. Wool soaked up damp air and refused to dry, leaving you wrapped in icy fabric that scratched and froze at the same time. Gloves were rare, shoes thin. Tasks like hauling water or gardening turned into exercises in frostbite. Your fingers stiffened around tools until you could hardly feel them, and yet the work never stopped. The calendar didn't care if the ground was frozen solid. The bells still rang. The chores still called. And then came the hunger. Winter gardens offered little, and fasting rules didn't relax just because food was scarce. Meals grew smaller, thinner, colder. A bowl of hot stew might have saved spirits. But more often, it was lukewarm pottage that cooled before you finished it. Hunger in winter wasn't just discomfort, it was weakness layered over weakness. Fatigue piled onto freezing bones. Illness spread easily in the cold. Coughs echoed through stone halls. Fevers took root in bodies already worn thin, and there was little medicine to be found. Prayer and penance were the remedies, which did little against frostbite or pneumonia. To get sick in winter meant you had two battles to fight, one against your own body, and one against the belief that illness itself was somehow a spiritual failing. Yet, strangely, the monastery praised the suffering. Winter was seen as purification, a time when the soul could prove itself by surviving the elements. Monks were told that every shiver was a prayer, every icy breath a step closer to God. But it was hard to believe that when your lips turned blue and your bones ached with cold, holiness didn't feel like fire in the spirit. It felt like numbness creeping up your arms. The season eventually passed, but it always left scars, fingers that never quite healed, lungs that rattled for months, and memories of nights where the only prayer you had left was that morning would actually come. Winter in the monastery wasn't just weather. It was a sermon preached by frost, and the lesson was always the same. Suffering had no end, only colder chapters. If winter froze monks into silence, summer baked them alive. The same stone walls that trapped frost in January now turned into ovens by July, radiating heat long after the sun had gone down. And unlike the seasons outside, the monastery rules never changed. The robe stayed the same, the schedule stayed the same, the silence stayed the same. What changed was how much sweat a human body could produce before collapsing. The robe, already scratchy in cold weather, became unbearable in the heat. Thick wool clung to skin like a wet blanket, soaking through with sweat and refusing to dry. You couldn't remove it, couldn't roll up the sleeves, couldn't strip down to something cooler. Modesty and uniformity came first. That meant you labored in the gardens with sweat dripping down your back, or sat in the chapel while damp fabric glued itself to your chest. Holiness, apparently, was measured in how well you endured the suffocating embrace of your own clothing. Sleep didn't bring relief. Cells turned stifling as the day's heat clung to stone walls. Air barely moved through narrow windows, and candles added to the staleness. You lay there sweating, itching, and wide awake, knowing that the bell would drag you up for prayer long before you found rest. The silence amplified it all, the buzz of flies, the rasp of breath, the drip of sweat down your temple. Nothing about summer nights felt peaceful. Meals offered little comfort. Bread grew moldy faster, vegetables spoiled, and water drawn from wells grew warm and murky. Ale was thin and sour. Fasting rules didn't relax, which meant you endured hunger on top of dehydration. Lips cracked, throats burned, and brothers collapsed in fields under the blazing sun, only to be told their fainting was another form of devotion. Suffering in the cold was holy, Suffering in the heat was holy. Suffering, it seemed, was always holy. Work became torment. Gardens flourished in summer, which meant endless hours of bending, hauling, and sweating under a relentless sky. Chanting in the chapel turned into a test of endurance, voices rasping as throats dried out. Some monks whispered prayers for rain, not out of piety, but sheer desperation for relief. When storms came, the cool breeze felt like a miracle until the mud arrived, dragging the misery into yet another form. The monastery spun it into virtue. Heat burned away pride, they said, just as fire purified metal. Sweat was sacrifice, thirst was discipline, exhaustion was grace. But for the men inside the robes, it didn't feel like refinement. It felt like punishment written into the weather, as if God himself had decided the cloister wasn't hard enough already. Summer eventually ended, but it never felt like survival. It felt like endurance on repeat. Another reminder that in the monastery, even the seasons weren't allowed to be kind. Each one brought its own brand of suffering, and summer's gift was simple: the knowledge that misery didn't melt it, only steamed. Spring should have been a relief after winter's frost and summer's suffocating heat. But in a monastery, spring was just another variation of misery, served with extra dampness. The season promised rebirth and renewal outside the cloister walls, but inside, it mostly delivered mud, mold, and another set of rules to follow. The thaw brought water flooding into every crack of the stonework. Corridors dripped, walls wept, and floors turned slick with moisture. Mud clung to sandals, smeared across cloisters, and seeped into cells until you felt like you were sleeping on wet earth. The smell of mildew crept in, thick and sour, coating every surface with a reminder that spring was less about flowers and more about rot. Gardens exploded with life, which meant work doubled. Monks trudged through muddy plots, planting seeds, pulling weeds, and trying to coax order out of chaos. Hands cracked from the wet soil, robes stained permanently with grime. The silence made it worse, no conversation to distract from the ache of bending, no laughter to drown out the squelch of mud sucking at your feet. You worked until your back screamed, and still the mud seemed endless, swallowing every effort. And then came the rules. With new growth came new regulations about fasting, feast days, and the proper way to celebrate holy seasons. Lent stretched on with restrictions that tightened already empty stomachs. Easter brought rituals that filled the chapel with longer chants and stricter observances. Even the joy of spring was rationed, sliced into ceremonies that drained more energy than they gave. Inside the monastery, spring wasn't colourful blossoms. It was mildew spreading on damp walls, candles that sputtered in wet air, and cold draughts that refused to leave even as the sun grew warmer. Brothers coughed through the dampness. Fevers lingered, and the infirmary filled with men, worn thin by the constant strain of weather and rule alike. Renewal didn't mean rest. It meant new ways to suffer. The season highlighted the contradiction of cloistered life. Outside, peasants welcomed the thaw, grateful for longer days and fresh growth. Birds returned, fields brightened, and life seemed possible again. Inside, monks trudged through mud and mold, trapped in a rhythm that refused to change with the seasons. The world bloomed, but the monastery stayed grey, and that was the cruelest part of spring in a cloister. You could hear the birds through narrow windows, see the fields turning green just beyond the walls, smell fresh blossoms carried in on the wind, and none of it belonged to you. All you had was mud underfoot, mold on the walls, and rules that multiplied as fast as the weeds. Spring didn't feel like rebirth. It felt like another reminder that even when the world outside renewed itself, the cloister only deepened its hold. Autumn outside the cloister meant harvest, abundance, and tables piled high with food. Inside the monastery, it meant the slow realization that winter was coming and you were about to starve more creatively than usual. Autumn wasn't a season of plenty for monks, it was a season of inventory, rationing, and dread. The gardens produced their last crops, and everything had to be gathered, sorted, and stored. Cabbages were salted, beans dried, onions braided into strings. It looked impressive at first. Cellars lined with barrels and shelves, stacked with produce. But monks knew the truth. No matter how full the storerooms looked in October, by February they would be scraping the bottom, boiling scraps into watery soup, pretending it was enough to keep a body alive. Autumn wasn't about enjoying the harvest. It was about stretching it, thinning it, and worrying over every bite. Meals in this season reflected the anxiety. Portions grew smaller as abbots enforced rationing early to prepare the soul for winter. Fresh fruit was rare, meat almost non-existent, and bread grew harder as stores of decent grain dwindled. Every mouthful carried calculation how much was left, how long it might last, and whether you would still be gnawing the same loaf come spring. Hunger wasn't postponed until winter. It started in autumn, quietly, like a shadow settling over the refectory. The work was endless. Brothers spent hours in the fields, bent double in the chill air, pulling crops from damp soil while frost nipped at their fingers. Others labored in storerooms, hauling sacks, salting vegetables, turning spoils into something barely edible. The silence made it heavier. No jokes, no talk, just the scrape of tools and the echo of hunger gnawing through every man there. Autumn was supposed to be a time of relief, but for monks, it felt like a season-long reminder of what they were about to endure. And the fear wasn't just about food. Cold winds signaled the return of sickness, weak bodies breaking under frost and fatigue. Monks watched the leaves fall, each one like a ticking clock toward nights of shivering, coughing, and fasting that never seemed to end. The monastery dressed this up as discipline accepting scarcity as a path to holiness. But everyone knew that holiness often looked a lot like starvation. Visitors sometimes shared feasts in autumn. Nobles or pilgrims welcomed with fresh bread and vegetables from the monastery gardens. The monks served them with bowed heads, then returned to their own bowls of thin gruel. Nothing revealed the hypocrisy of cloistered equality more clearly than watching outsiders eat well while the brothers endured scarcity in silence. Autumn wasn't golden fields or crackling fires in the cloister. It was the slow tightening of belts, the knowledge that every bite was borrowed time. Each day of the harvest brought less joy and more calculation, and by the time the first frost covered the ground, the monastery was already living on the edge, waiting for winter to finish what autumn had begun. In the monastery, getting sick wasn't just a matter of bad luck. It was a spiritual test, and one you weren't likely to win. Illness stripped away whatever thin layer of endurance you had left, and the only treatment available was prayer, endless, fervent, desperate prayer. Medicine, as we understand it, didn't exist here, and even if it had, monks often distrusted it, preferring to believe that healing came only from God, never from herbs, remedies, or human skill. The infirmary was a grim place. It wasn't stocked with potions or salves. At best, you might get a bed slightly softer than your usual plank and a blanket that didn't smell quite as moldy. A brother might bring you a bowl of thin broth, and the community would pray over you. That was the extent of medical care. If your fever broke, it was seen as divine mercy. If it didn't, then clearly God had other plans for you. Colds, coughs, fevers, these spread quickly in damp, drafty corridors, where monks lived packed together, sharing air and filth. Winter brought pneumonia, spring brought fevers, and summer carried infections that spread like fire. With no sanitation to speak of, sickness never stayed isolated. One coughing brother could bring down a dozen more, and the cloister echoed with the sound of wheezing lungs and rasping throats. The monastery's answer was always the same: prayer and penance. If you were sick, you prayed harder. If you couldn't pray aloud, others prayed over you, as if chanting could burn the sickness out of your body. Sometimes you were told your illness was punishment, a consequence of hidden sin. Other times, it was framed as purification, a holy fire consuming your weakness. Either way, you were expected to accept it without complaint. The truth, of course, was crueler. Without medicine, without rest, without warmth or proper nutrition, many monks didn't recover. They wasted away in their cells, shivering and coughing, while the community sang psalms in the chapel. Death came often, quietly, and the silence of the cloister only made it feel more inevitable. Brothers died, not because their faith failed, but because their bodies were left to fight with nothing but hope. And yet, illness wasn't seen as defeat. It was another chance to prove devotion. A monk who suffered patiently, who refused to complain as his body failed, was praised as a model of holiness. His pain was reframed as sacrifice, his decline as victory. The monastery didn't cure sickness, it sanctified it. For the sick, that meant there was no relief, only endurance, no warm fire, no healing touch, no remedy stronger than whispered words, just prayer, rising into the cold air, while bodies grew weaker and breath slipped away. Illness in the monastery wasn't something to fight, it was something to accept, even as it swallowed you whole. Death was not an interruption in monastic life. It was woven into the rhythm, expected and even welcomed as the final surrender to God. Burials were framed as holy ceremonies, reminders that the monk who died had crossed into eternal life. But under the solemn chanting and ritual words lay something far more grim, the undeniable reality of rot. When a brother died, the body was laid out in the chapel for prayers. Monks gathered in silence, chanting psalms, while the corpse rested nearby, wrapped in nothing more than a simple robe. Coffins were often absent. The body itself was placed directly into the earth, as if to prove once again that the flesh was worthless. It was supposed to symbolize humility, but the sight of a dead companion, pale and stiff in the dim candlelight, was anything but comforting. The smell arrived quickly. Without embalming or preservation, decomposition began within hours. The cloister filled with the sour tang of decay, clinging to the air even as incense burned furiously to cover it. Monks tried to frame it as a spiritual lesson. The body was temporary, destined to return to dust. But no amount of pious explanation erased the nausea in the stomach or the sting in the nose. The glory of death was accompanied by a stench that refused to leave. Burial itself was simple, sometimes shockingly so. The dead were carried to the monastery graveyard, a plot of land, often damp, muddy, and crowded. Graves were shallow, dug quickly by weary brothers with crude tools. The body was lowered into the earth, covered in soil, and marked with little more than a wooden cross. There was no grandeur, no monuments, no memory preserved beyond a name in a ledger. The living returned to prayer, and the dead faded into the earth. And yet, the ceremony was painted as triumphant. Death was called a gateway to eternal joy, the end of struggle, the victory of spirit over flesh. Hymns celebrated the monk's devotion, his suffering, his obedience to the very end. But for those who stayed behind, the truth was less glorious. They saw their brother lowered into damp ground, smelled the rot lingering on their robes, and knew they would meet the same fate soon enough. The graveyard grew crowded quickly. Rows of simple mounds, each one a reminder that the monastery consumed lives as steadily as it consumed days. Visiting the graves wasn't optional. It was a ritual, a way to remind monks daily that their own time was coming. You prayed over the dead not just for them, but for yourself, because their fate was your future. Burials promised glory, yes, but what lingered in the air, in the nose, in memory, was not triumph, it was decay. The monastery taught you to call it holy, but your senses told you otherwise. Death didn't smell like victory. It smelled like the inevitable, waiting patiently in the silence of the cloister. After endless fasting, chanting, and cold nights, heaven was described to monks as the ultimate reward, eternal peace, joy beyond imagination, freedom from suffering. But when monks actually spoke of their visions of heaven, the details sounded strangely familiar. Heaven, in their minds, often resembled the one thing they were denied most on earth: rest. Monks dreamed of golden light, choirs of angels, banquets of endless food. Yet beneath those grand images was a quieter longing. Heaven wasn't just about divine glory. It was about finally lying down without the bell dragging you up again. It was about sleep uninterrupted, warmth without guilt, silence without punishment. For men who spent their lives exhausted, heaven often looked less like celestial majesty and more like a bed that didn't hurt. The sermons painted heaven as dazzling streets of gold, thrones of light, eternity in God's presence. But the monks' private writings revealed something humbler. Some described paradise as a place without hunger, where bread was always soft and wine never ran dry. Others wrote of eternal stillness, where no rules cut through the day, no voices scolded, no bells broke the dark. Heaven, in other words, was a monastery stripped of its misery. The irony was sharp. Monks gave up earthly comforts for decades, only to imagine heaven as the very comforts they had denied themselves. Endless rest, full stomachs, warmth, and freedom from rules, all the things they were told to abandon here, became the reward they hoped for there. Heaven wasn't some abstract mystery, it was the life they had wanted all along, finally given back to them after death. For monks, the vision of heaven wasn't so much about escaping the world as it was about escaping the cloister. And when they whispered about paradise, what they described sounded suspiciously simple. A place where the body was no longer an enemy, where sleep lasted as long as it needed to, and where suffering finally stopped pretending to be holy. If heaven was painted as rest, hell was painted as torment, vivid, endless, and terrifying enough to keep monks awake, even when their bodies begged for sleep. Hellfire sermons were a constant in the cloister, delivered with such intensity that you could almost feel the flames licking at your ankles while you sat in the cold stone chapel. Preachers spared no detail. They described demons tearing at flesh, rivers of fire swallowing the damned, screams echoing forever without pause. For monks already living in deprivation, the imagery felt close, almost too close. Hunger pangs were rebranded as a taste of hell's famine. Frostbite hinted at eternal cold. Fevered nights in the infirmary were preached as warnings of the eternal burning to come. Every discomfort of monastic life became a sermon illustration, as if daily suffering wasn't enough without being magnified into eternity. The purpose was control. Fear worked better than comfort at binding men to obedience. If a brother doubted, if he faltered, if he even entertained the idea of leaving, the sermons reminded him of what awaited outside the walls. Not freedom, but damnation. The monastery became the safe path, and any deviation was framed as a step straight into the fire. Monks internalized it. Dreams twisted into nightmares of falling into flames. Prayers became frantic pleas to avoid punishment rather than genuine longing for God. The threat of hell didn't inspire holiness. It inspired terror, a kind of spiritual paranoia that seeped into every choice. You weren't just trying to obey the rules, you were trying to outrun eternal fire. And yet, the irony was brutal. The monastery's sermons painted hell as unbearable torment, but monks already lived in something close to it. The heat of summer robes, the hunger of fasting, the silence of guilt, all of it mirrored the suffering they were told awaited sinners. The difference was that their pain was temporary, while the sermons promised hell would never end. For monks, the fear of hell wasn't just a belief, it was a shadow cast over every moment, keeping them chained to obedience, reminding them that even misery on earth was preferable to the nightmare preached from the pulpit. After a long day of chanting, copying, digging, and starving under the weight of rules, you might think the monastery at least offered some comfort in the evening meal. Dinner, after all, should be the moment where exhaustion is eased, where bodies are refueled, where the smallest scrap of joy can be found. But in a monastery, dinner was never comfort. It was ritual. It was ration. It was obedience, ladled into a bowl and called food. The refectory was cold, lined with stone benches and wooden tables worn smooth from decades of elbows and silence. Monks filed in quietly, robes heavy with sweat or dampness, stomachs already hollow from fasting. The smell of food should have lifted spirits, but the truth was that dinner never smelled like abundance. It smelled like thin broth simmered too long, bread already stale, vegetables boiled until they surrendered all texture and taste. Hunger sharpened your senses, but not enough to turn disappointment into satisfaction. Portions were meager and carefully measured. No heaping plates, no second helpings, no generosity. What you were given was what you ate, even if your stomach growled so loudly you feared others could hear it through the silence. And silence was the law. Dinner wasn't a time for conversation, for laughter, or even for a sigh of relief. While you chewed, another brother read from scripture or sermons, his voice droning over the scrape of spoons. You didn't eat to enjoy. You ate to endure. Your body fueled just enough to keep going until the next fast, the next prayer, the next day of the same. The food itself mocked the word meal. The bread was dense and tooth-cracking, often stale enough to require dunking in broth just to break it apart. The soup was watery, sometimes flavored with onions or leeks, but rarely more than a thin echo of nourishment. Meat was absent except on rare feast days, and even then it arrived boiled into grey lumps that made chewing feel like penance. Salt was scarce, spices unheard of. Flavour was treated as vanity, so blandness became a virtue. Dinner wasn't about feeding your senses, it was about starving them into submission. The irony was glaring. Monks preached detachment from the world, but food dominated their lives. Fasting, feasting, portion sizes, dietary rules, everything revolved around what went into their bowls. They were told not to care about flavour, yet their thoughts were consumed by it. Dinner was less about eating and more about proving you could swallow misery without complaint. And yet, for all its meagerness, dinner still carried weight. It was the one consistent ritual that ended every day. No matter how much you suffered in the fields, no matter how raw your throat felt from chanting, no matter how frozen your fingers were from winter work, you sat with your brothers and ate the same scraps together. That unity was twisted but undeniable. The monastery fed you poorly, but it fed you all poorly, and that was enough to remind you that suffering was communal. Still, when you pushed away the empty bowl and rose in silence, you didn't feel nourished. You felt reminded. Dinner wasn't a gift. It was a warning that even the most basic human pleasure, the act of eating, could be hollowed out, stripped of joy, and turned into another sermon you swallowed without choice. If dinner left you hollow, night vigils finished the job. Just when your body finally began to sag with the weight of exhaustion, when sleep promised to drag you into brief relief, the bell struck again. Midnight was not a time for rest in the monastery. It was a time for prayer, a ritual interruption that tore sleep into pieces and called it devotion. The night vigil was framed as a holy act, a way of keeping watch with God while the world slumbered. Monks were told that rising in the dark made them soldiers of the spirit, alert while others were weak. In practice, it was spiritualized sleep deprivation. You stumbled from your hard bed, robe clinging to your damp skin, and shuffled through stone corridors colder than any dream could prepare you for. The chapel glowed faintly with candles, shadows stretching long across the floor. Rows of monks knelt or stood, voices rising in chants that echoed against the stone, until they blurred into a low drone. Your eyelids sagged, your body begged to collapse, but you forced yourself to mouth the words. The vigil wasn't optional. If you faltered, your weakness showed, and weakness, in the monastery, was sin in disguise. The hours dragged, psalms blurred together, the rhythm hypnotic but never soothing. Kneeling on hard stone ground cut into your knees until they throbbed. The candlelight stung your eyes, already raw from fatigue. Every instinct told you to sleep, yet the rule demanded the opposite. The night vigil turned the natural rhythm of rest upside down, proving once again that the monastery's greatest weapon wasn't chains or whips, it was the slow grind of exhaustion. Monks convinced themselves there was purpose. Rising at midnight symbolized readiness for judgment, the idea that Christ could return at any hour and the faithful must be prepared. But behind that symbolism was misery, and every monk felt it. Some nodded off mid-chant, jerking awake in shame. Others swayed as they stood, fighting the pull of sleep with every ounce of will. Punishment awaited those who collapsed entirely, as if exhaustion itself was rebellion. And the cruelest part? The vigil didn't end quickly. By the time you were released, the sky outside was still dark, and sleep never came easily after. You returned to your cell, heart pounding from fatigue, mind buzzing with psalms that wouldn't stop circling. Dreams, when they finally came, were fractured and fleeting. The bell would drag you up again before they had time to settle. The vigil stole more than rest. It stole dreams themselves. Whatever comfort sleep could bring was carved into fragments, reduced to scraps that left the mind weary and the body aching. For monks, the night didn't hold peace. It held obligation, another reminder that even the most natural rhythms of life were not yours to keep. By daylight, the memory of the vigil lingered. Heavy eyes, aching limbs, voices rasping from midnight chants. Every new day carried the weight of lost hours, and still the bell called you back each night. The vigil wasn't just a ritual. It was a slow erosion, pulling dreams from you until you forgot what it felt like to sleep without fear of being woken. For most people, the bed is the one place of refuge at the end of a long day. It doesn't matter if the work was hard, The food was bad, or the weather was cruel. Climbing under blankets should at least offer relief. But in the monastery, even that tiny mercy was denied. Beds weren't comfort. They were yet another tool of discipline, built to remind you that rest itself was not a right, but a temptation to resist. A monk's bed was usually a simple wooden plank, or, if he was lucky, a rough frame stuffed with straw. But the straw was never fresh for long. It flattened into lumps, gathered mold from the damp air, and scratched through the thin fabric meant to cover it. Lice often nested in it, crawling over skin as you tried to sleep. Blankets were thin, sometimes damp, and smelled of smoke and sweat. You didn't crawl into bed hoping for comfort. You crawled in, hoping to survive the night, without freezing or itching yourself raw. The bed wasn't meant to cradle you. It was meant to harden you. Comfort was seen as dangerous, a slippery slope to sloth and vanity. If your back ached, good, it kept you alert. If your neck stiffened, even better, it reminded you that the flesh was weak. Some monasteries even encouraged monks to sleep sitting upright or to rest directly on bare floors. The harder the surface, the holier the intention. It wasn't rest. It was rehearsal for death, a nightly reminder that the body was not meant to be indulged. And then came the interruptions. Even if you somehow drifted off, you rarely stayed asleep for long. The midnight vigil carved the night in half, dragging you from whatever shallow slumber you had managed to find. By the time you returned to your bed, the straw was colder, the blanket damper, the lice more active. Sleep came in fragments, never in full cycles, leaving you as tired when you woke as when you first lay down. The silence made things worse. You couldn't complain to a neighbor about your aching back or joke about the hardness of the bed. Pain had to be swallowed quietly, endured as part of obedience. The only sound in the dormitory was the restless shifting of dozens of men, equally miserable coughs in the dark, groans muffled into blankets, the scratching of skin that never seemed to stop itching. In the stillness, suffering echoed louder. Beds should have been a sanctuary, but here they became cages. The cell where you slept was not a refuge but an extension of discipline, a place where even unconsciousness was rationed. Dreams dissolved into discomfort, and mornings arrived with bodies no more refreshed than the night before. Day after day, year after year, monks lived in a cycle where rest never restored, only reminded them of what they lacked. The irony was brutal. The very object designed for comfort became another weapon of austerity. Monks renounced soft beds and warm blankets, but in doing so, they renounced the small mercy that might have allowed them to endure everything else. Hard beds didn't make them saints. They just made them tired, broken, and more easily bent to the weight of obedience. And yet, this suffering was reframed as victory. A monk who slept on a plank was praised for devotion. One who endured winters with only a thin blanket was admired for discipline. The more miserable your nights, the holier you appeared. The monastery didn't need to police every dream. It only needed to make sure your bed never let you forget that suffering was the rule, even in the hours meant for rest. When outsiders imagined monks at peace in their quiet cells, they pictured stillness, serenity, maybe even a kind of noble simplicity. What they didn't picture was the constant ache of bones pressed against wood, the damp straw scratching skin, the crawling lice, the stiff neck that refused to heal. They didn't see that for monks, the floor often looked more merciful than the bed itself. Sleep was supposed to be a blessing. In the monastery, it became just another burden. And every night, as you lay stiff and aching on a bed that mocked the very idea of comfort, you understood the cloister's final lesson. Even in your most private moments, rest was not yours to claim. The cruelest thing about monastic life was that it never really ended. Days blurred into nights, nights shattered into fragments by bells, and every morning came with the same hollow promise. Today would be different. But it never was. Morning always returned, dragging misery back into the cell with it. The bell rang in the dark, shattering what little rest you had managed to steal. Your body was stiff from the plank that pretended to be a bed, your skin still itching from straw, your eyes burning from lost sleep. The cold floor greeted you like an enemy you had already lost to, and the scratchy robe sealed the reminder that comfort would never come. The chapel filled again. Monks chanted psalms in voices hoarse from repetition, rising and falling in rhythms that no longer stirred the heart. Words of prayer blurred into noise, and yet you mouthed them dutifully, because not doing so meant punishment. Even faith had become routine, a performance you couldn't escape. Breakfast was no better. Gruel ladled into bowls, bread so stale you risked breaking a tooth, silence that pressed as heavily as hunger. You ate because it was commanded, not because it satisfied. Hunger was never quenched, only managed, stretched out like every other deprivation. The day unfolded exactly as it had yesterday and as it would tomorrow. Work in the gardens, copying in the scriptorium, sweeping endless corridors of dust that always returned. The hours ticked by, marked by bells that chopped time into segments too small for peace. The rules gave you structure, yes, but they also made sure that every scrap of your life belonged to the monastery, not to you. And so the cycle continued. Morning after morning, misery recycled itself. You woke, you prayed, you ate, you worked, you endured, and you called it holiness. But deep down, you knew the truth. The misery wasn't holy. It was just misery, dressed in robes, wrapped in silence, justified by rules that mistook suffering for salvation. Some monks tried to find meaning in it. They told themselves that every ache was a prayer, every hunger pang a step toward heaven, every sleepless night a chance to stand guard against temptation. But others saw only the emptiness, days that bled into each other without joy, voices lost in chants that no longer touched the soul. Some broke silently, slipping deeper into despair with each passing year, their faith not purified, but drained. This was the reality, hidden behind the romantic image of monks as serene, enlightened men untouched by the world. The monastery didn't erase human struggle, it magnified it. Every bell was a reminder that your life was not your own. Every robe, every fast, every vigil, every bed of straw was part of a system designed to grind you down until obedience was all that remained. And when the next morning arrived, it didn't bring renewal. It brought the same bell, the same hunger, the same aching body forced to kneel on cold stone. Misery was not an accident of monastic life. It was the foundation of it, repeated endlessly, year after year, until you either broke completely or convinced yourself that breaking was what holiness meant all along. So the bell rang again, and once more, you rose. Not because you wanted to, not because you hoped, but because in the monastery, misery itself was the only thing that always returned. And that sound, the iron voice of the bell, wasn't just the start of another day. It was the reminder that there was no escape, only repetition, until the final silence of death offered the one release. The monastery never would.